Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Midtown Scholar Bookstore. My name is Alex. I'm with the bookstore. We're delighted you're here with us this evening, and we hope you enjoyed tonight's program with renowned climate scientist Michael Mann. Before we begin, I have some quick housekeeping to go over as always. First, we're excited to announce the full lineup and schedule for the 11th Annual Harrisburg Book Festival this fall. We'll be hosting many authors, including events with George Saunders, Steve Inskeep, Liza Mundy, Viet Thanh Nguyen, Emily Wilson, and many more authors. The festival will take place from October 18th to the 22nd, and the website is now live at hbgbookfest.com. Please take an events flyer as you leave. Stay tuned to our social media pages and website. Mark your calendars, and we hope to see you again this October. Second, tonight would not have been possible without the partnership and support of one of our favorite stateside organizations, PennFuture. If you're not familiar with them, they are a nonprofit focusing on a clean energy economy and protecting air, water, land, and sustainable communities in Pennsylvania and beyond. In fact, tonight, with every purchase of our Fragile Moment, we will be donating 10% of the proceeds to PennFuture. That includes all online pre-orders and in-store purchases through tonight. So can we go ahead and give PennFuture a round of applause for the good work they're doing? Lastly, as I mentioned, we encourage you to come away with a signed copy of Our Fragile Moment this evening. Dr. Mann will be sticking around afterwards for a book signing, and a quick reminder that book sales are the bedrock of sustainability for our free author events, and every purchase helps support the bookstore, our staff, the authors, and the future of our programming. Books are available for purchase up at the cafe. But at this time, it's my honor to introduce our speakers this evening. Our interviewer this evening is Patrick McDonnell. Patrick brings over 20 years of experience on climate, clean energy, and environmental issues to his role as president and CEO of PennFuture. Prior to joining PennFuture, he spent 6 years as secretary of the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection, leading key initiatives like passage of the state's first carbon trading regulation, acceleration of the Commonwealth's cleanup of waterways, and a new focus on environmental justice issues. He also served as president of the Environmental Council of the States, the voice of state environmental agencies nationally. He is a firm believer that environmental-focused policies will result in new jobs and opportunities for all Pennsylvanians. Of course, our featured author this evening is Michael E. Mann. Michael is the Presidential Distinguished Professor and Director of the Center for Science, Sustainability, and Media at the University of Pennsylvania. He has received many honors and awards, including NOAA's Outstanding Publication Award in 2002 and selection by Scientific American as one of the 50 leading visionaries in science and technology in 2002. Additionally, he contributed with other IPCC authors to the award of the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize. In 2020, he was elected to the U.S. National Academy of Sciences. He is the author of numerous books, and he lives in State College, Pennsylvania. Of course, his new book that we are here for this evening is titled Our Fragile Moment: How Lessons from Earth's Past Can Help Us Survive the Climate Crisis. Former U.S. Vice President Al Gore writes, quote, "Man has a tremendous depth of knowledge about the history of our planet's climate, which is why his words of warning and optimism are so important. This book provides important lessons from humanity's past to empower readers to help protect our future," end quote. We're very honored to host Michael E. Mann and Patrick McDonnell this evening, so without further ado, please join me in giving them a warm round of applause.
Thank you.
Welcome to Harrisburg.
It's great to be back.
Yes, and thank you. Not included in that is Mike is one of the board members for us at PennFuture as well. Very happy.
Honored.
Yeah, very happy to work with him. To kick us off here tonight, just for those who may not be familiar with you, your work, if you could give us just your origin story. How did you get activated about climate issues and become really the guy on climate science in the U.S.?
Well, it's very kind of you. I was just a science nerd in high school and went off to college, went off to UC Berkeley to study physics and applied math, decided to go on to get a PhD in physics, and along the way, I decided that I wasn't excited enough about the sorts of projects that I was being given, so I literally walked down the hill to the Department of Geology and Geophysics at Yale, where I met my soon-to-be advisor, Barry Saltzman. He was using math and physics to model Earth's climate system. And this was back in the late 80s, early 90s, sort of early on in the development of climate science. And it sounded fascinating to me, and so I decided to instead do my PhD with him in the Department of Geology and Geophysics. And along the way, we got interested in analyzing what are known as climate proxy data. We only have about 150 years of widespread thermometer measurements, and they tell us that the planet is warmed, but they don't tell us how unusual that sort of warming is. We need to turn to other indirect measures of climate that we call proxies, like tree rings and corals and ice cores, to reconstruct how the climate changed in the more distant past. And so the work that I did ultimately led to the publication of what was known as the hockey stick curve. It was an estimate of how temperatures had varied over the past 600, and then a year later we extended it to the past 1,000 years. And the hockey stick, as I sometimes say, became a lightning rod. It became a symbol in the climate change debate, which was really getting going in the late 1990s, because it told a simple story. You didn't need to understand the complex workings of Earth's climate system to understand what this curve was telling us. It's shaped like a hockey stick, and the blade is the warming of the industrial era. And it spoke to the unprecedented nature of the warming that we are causing through fossil fuel burning, that made it a threat to powerful vested interests that Patrick has dealt with over the years as well. And there was an effort to discredit the hockey stick. I had senators and congressmen. There was a whole sort of attack machine that was focused on discrediting the hockey stick. And people who knew me knew that I wasn't going to shy away from a worthy battle. And so ultimately, I've embraced the opportunity that that gave me to play a role, to be in a position to inform the larger conversation about what is arguably the greatest challenge that we face as a civilization. And so I thank my detractors and my critics for ultimately providing me a platform to do that. And that's sort of the theme of this new book, Our Fragile Moment, is what we can learn about the past, not just the hockey stick, which goes back 1,000 years, but we've got 4 billion years of, more than 4 billion years of Earth history, more than 4 billion years of lessons that we can potentially learn. I guess that's my origin story, and that's how we got here.
Excellent. And before we talk about the book, the other just fascinating thing to me is, you were at Penn State, you moved to University of Pennsylvania, now with the Center for Science, Sustainability, and the Media, which I think is again, really, really interesting in terms of connecting those three things. Can you talk a bit about the mission, the direction that you're looking to take the center in?
Thanks, yeah. So, I mean, the move from Penn State to Penn was actually quite easy. I just took my business card and I crossed off the state, and it was the easiest move ever, actually. And I still do spend time in State College. My wife and daughter are still there, and then I spend some of my time in Philadelphia. And thanks to Amtrak, I can go back and forth and come through Harrisburg all the time, coming or going. So yes, I am now at the University of Pennsylvania, Penn, and one of the things that I loved Penn State, I loved my colleagues there, but I was ready for a new challenge, and the University of Pennsylvania came to me and said, we'd like you to come here, we'd like you to start up a center at the intersection of the things that I was so passionate about, both the science, and I continue to do the science, and I have students and postdoctoral researchers who are still working on various topics in climate science that inform our assessment of the impacts of climate change and the solutions to the climate crisis. But I also am very passionate about the communication of the science and its implications. Again, by accident, my critics sort of forced me into the public sphere And I leaned into that and decided that I'm actually, it's not what I signed up for. It's not what I thought I would be doing when I double majored in applied math and physics at UC Berkeley. But I can think of no more important thing to be doing today than informing precisely this conversation. And our center tries to bring together the College of the School of Arts and Sciences, our Department of Earth and Environmental Science, with the sort of tremendous resources that come with the Annenberg School for Communication at Penn. So this is a joint venture of Arts and Sciences and the Annenberg School. And for me, I'm like a kid in a candy store because I've got all of the resources of Annenberg, which is one of the leading schools in the country when it comes to journalism and communication. And I've got just such tremendous colleagues in the sciences, in the social sciences, in humanities, and in all of the other traditional areas of academia, because this is a problem that goes well beyond science. I came into it as a scientist, but I've learned that it's, science is part of it, but it's about socioeconomic impacts. It's about issues like climate justice. It's about ethics, our ethical obligation to future generations, the humanities, the arts. There's so many different disciplines that come into this problem now. It's the most interdisciplinary problem that you can be studying today. And so Penn is just a wonderful place to be doing it. There is sort of an interesting angle here, which is that my grandfather, my father, and my uncle all went to Penn. Now I teach at Penn, so I figure if our daughter decides to go to Penn, she'll be a fourth generation Penn student, Penn affiliate, I'm not sure. So there's a family connection. In Philadelphia, I spent a lot of time. It was like a second home when I was growing up in South Philly, where my grandparents lived. And so it's a homecoming of sorts, and it's great to be there. I'm really excited about it.
That's great. As someone from Northeast Philly originally, very much appreciate your love of the city. You talked about communication. I think that's a good moment to talk about the new book, Our Fragile Moment. If you can just, I always find titles fascinating. So just the title, Our Fragile Moment, as we're talking about literally millions of years over the course of the book, heating and cooling periods and what causes that. Why Our Fragile Moment as the title and the thing you want people to take away when looking at the cover?
Thanks. Thanks for the question. Sure. It's funny because the title is always this process between you and your editor, and I'd like to take full credit for it, but I want to give some credit really to my editor. We were looking for a title that really captured the message of the book, and originally we were playing around with something like Our Benevolent Moment. And I'm not sure it's benevolent, and when it comes to climate or any of the other crises and challenges we face today, it just didn't. But it is fragile. It's the fragility of the moment, and what that speaks to is, we are at this precipice right now. There is this envelope of climate variability, of natural climate variability, that is in fact quite small. I mean, the global climate was remarkably stable for the last 6,000 years up until the Industrial Revolution. And all of this infrastructure that we've created was built for that climate, that very stable climate, and is dependent on that climate remaining so. And we are now rapidly leaving that window that envelope of variability that defines the environment that in which we built our civilization. That represents a real threat to us, to other living things. One of the messages, though, from looking at the past, because some people today have fallen victim to sort of doom and despair, and it's sort of understandable. If you're following the 24-hour news cycle, it's easy to do, and they've become convinced it's too late to do anything about climate change. And sometimes you'll hear the paleoclimate record used to argue for that sort of doomist outlook, past extinction events and what drove them, and the claim that we're experiencing the same thing now and there's nothing we can do, it's unstoppable, and it's not true. And so originally, when I envisioned this project, I wanted to sort of address doomism, which was a theme of my last book, The New Climate War. But in the process of doing that, I realized, well, that's an important story, and these past mass extinctions are important stories, but we've got more than 4 billion years to work with. There ought to be some more lessons that we can learn from studying that history, and so that's what it's about. And where we come out when we look at the collective information, evidence from more than 4 billion years of Earth history, it sort of comes down to what I've been arguing before, which is urgency. We understand how urgent it is. If we continue with business as usual, we will rapidly leave that fragile moment behind. Urgency, but also agency. And the paleoclimate record also shows us that there is some amount of resilience within the Earth system, and that's helpful. If you push the system, it has a tendency to sort of come back to some extent. You push it too hard and too quickly, it can spiral out of control. So that's where we are right now. We're still within that regime where resilience is our friend, and where if we take dramatic action over the next decade, we can preserve this fragile moment. But if we fail to do that, the paleoclimate record has other lessons for us that aren't nearly as benevolent.
One of the striking lines from the book that you just referenced actually was as you look back at what happened with the dinosaurs and the asteroid, one of the lessons from that you describe is the dinosaurs did not have agency. We do have agency and the ability to address. As you looked back through this, as you said previously, you'd look back that 600,000 year time frame. Now you're looking back.
The hockey stick was only 1,000 years, so that's a veritable moment, a brief moment in time. Yeah.
Yeah. As you started looking back millions and millions of years, were there things that surprised you, things you hadn't considered in the work before? What were kind of your takeaways as you engaged in this project?
Yeah, it's technically I got my start in paleoclimate. This is sort of my subfield, but that is a very broad subfield, and there are people like my former Penn State colleague Lee Kump, who I reached out to in writing this book, who focus on some of these deep time, these much more distant past climate events, like the end Permian extinction 250 million years ago. My paleoclimate work, again, was focused really on like the last 1,000 years, which is really a tiny sliver. It sounds long to us. It's long compared to a human lifetime, but it is a tiny fraction of the lifetime of this planet, the 4.5 billion year lifetime of this planet. And so it's hard to be an expert in all, on all of these different timescales. So you reach out to others, and you do a lot of reading, and you do a lot of research. So I had to do a lot of research to write this book. Some people figure, oh, he's a paleoclimatologist, he could just write. No, I had to do a lot of research, and in particular, I had to figure out what the state of the art is now in our understanding, because science advances, and even in a period of 1 or 2 years, there can be studies that have a fundamental impact on the way we see some of these past events. And there have been some really important developments in paleoclimate science just over the past few years. So I had to do a lot of research, and I would say I didn't really know where I was going to come out. I didn't know after doing all that research what would emerge, what would be the pattern, what would be the message. And the message really was this sort of duality between fragility and resilience, that on very long time scales, and we could talk about the faint young sun. The sun was 30% less bright 4 billion years ago. The great Carl Sagan realized that there was a paradox there, because if you do the standard calculations, the Earth should have been frozen. It should have been a frozen planet. There shouldn't have been life, but we know the oceans were teeming with microbes. And so how was the planet warm enough for life and for liquid water when the sun was 30% dimmer? And Sagan realized it had to be a stronger greenhouse effect. And one of the most remarkable things, and it gets into the topic of Gaia, if you've heard of the Gaia hypothesis, there are these regulating mechanisms that Earth has, and life participates in those mechanisms. Life becomes more and more important in those mechanisms as time goes on. Life participates in the global carbon cycle. And one of the things that happens is the sun becomes steadily brighter. The greenhouse effect slowly gets lower and lower in just such a way that the temperature of the planet stays within habitable bounds. And so there's a remarkable resilience in the Earth system on these very long time scales. But if you look at what happened 2.5 billion years ago, where life, which can play a stabilizing role, played a very destabilizing role. We had the emergence of photosynthetic bacteria that produced oxygen, and we call it the Great Oxygenation Event. Prior to that, we had a oxygen-free atmosphere. We couldn't have breathed in the ancient Earth atmosphere. It was mostly methane and nitrogen, and there was this very strong early methane greenhouse effect. Then these bacteria emerged. These oxygen-generating bacteria, they took off exponentially, filled up the atmosphere with oxygen. It scavenged all of the methane. Methane isn't stable in the atmosphere. It doesn't stay in the atmosphere for more than a decade or so today because oxygen reacts with it. It scavenges it. And the methane plummeted. Temperatures plummeted. Ice built up. Ice reflects incoming sunlight, so the planet cooled more, and there was more and more ice. And Earth turned into a snowball. It's snowball Earth. Earth was a frozen planet with ice at the tropics. The tropical oceans were covered with a layer of ice. And life barely survived. It survived by seeking refuge, what we call refugia, hydrothermal vents deep in the ocean, maybe shallow pools of meltwater at the surface of the ice on the tropical oceans. So yes, life can participate in processes that stabilize the climate, but life can also play a very destabilizing role. And we have to ask today, how do we want to see ourselves? Do we want to be that stabilizing factor, or do we want to continue to be the destabilizing factor? It does get back to agency. The bacteria didn't have active thought patterns. The dinosaurs, couldn't have understood or done anything about their impending doom. The difference is that we don't have that excuse today.
So, in talking, in one, I should say, I had an opportunity to read the book and do not have the degrees, but could understand exactly how all of this progressed. In communicating this, are there things you think people get wrong, the media gets wrong, things you would like to see more attention paid to understand that fragility, that resiliency, and the duality of that today?
Yeah, thanks. There are a couple pet peeves that I have in that department. One of them, again, it gets back to this doomism. Very prevalent. There's a community of people now, you might call them climate doomers, like doomsdayers, but they are climate doomsdayers. They're convinced it's too late. They're convinced that we are seeing a runaway release of methane from the Arctic permafrost. It's a runaway warming process that we can't do anything about, and it will lead to the extinction of all life on Earth within a decade. There are some prominent players in that space who literally make that argument, and a lot of people are taken in by it. If you've heard deep adaptation, the deep adaptation movement. Even my friend David Wallace Wells, his book Uninhabitable Earth goes down a little too far down that road. It buys into that sort of runaway methane idea. It's not what's happening. We are measuring methane buildup in the atmosphere, and you know why? We can actually look at the isotopic fingerprint, the carbon isotopes in the methane, and figure out where they're coming from. And it looks like it's coming mostly from fracking, from natural gas extraction, and a secondary contribution from agriculture and livestock. So it's us. We're causing the rise in methane. It isn't a runaway natural feedback, and so it's just the opposite of what the doomers would have you think. Yes, there is a measurable rise in methane, and it is contributing to the warming, and it's caused primarily by human activity, not by some runaway process that we have no control over. That was, as I said, sort of part of what inspired the book, because you sometimes hear reference to the Great Dying, the end Permian extinction 250 million years ago, and the Great Dying is a good name for it. 90% of all species died out. 96% of ocean biota died out. And you'll sometimes hear the claim that, oh yeah, it was a runaway methane-driven warming event, just like what we're seeing today, and we're going to see a mass extinction for the same reason we're going to see our own great dying. And that's not what happened in that event. If you actually look at what the science says about that, or the other event that's sometimes talked about, the PETM, the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. I know, it just rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? But this is a rapid warming event, and rapid on geological timescales, which is to say it happened over, say, 10,000 years. So 100 times slower than the warming we're causing today. But if you're looking for a natural release of carbon dioxide and warming event in sort of past Earth history, it's the closest analog that we can find, even though it's 100 times slower than today. And you'll hear people say the PETM, it was also a runaway methane-driven warming scenario, and it's not. The primary driver, methane played a secondary role in both of those events. The primary driver was the release of carbon dioxide. Just like we're releasing carbon dioxide today much faster through fossil fuel burning, those were natural releases of carbon dioxide due to unusually active volcanic outgassing of carbon. And there's geology behind that I get into a little bit. But so the lessons to be drawn about those events aren't that we're doomed and we've triggered a runaway methane-driven warming scenario. It's the carbon dioxide, and we can do something about that accumulating carbon dioxide. One other thing I would mention in that regard, there is still this persistent belief, and the scientists have a lot to should get part of the blame here for not doing a good enough job in sort of informing the current public discourse over the science of climate change. There was this belief, more than a decade ago, that the planet would continue to warm up even if we stopped adding carbon pollution to the atmosphere because of what we call thermal inertia, the sluggishness of the oceans. They continue to warm up for decades even after you stop adding carbon dioxide. And that is true, but the climate models that we were using a decade and a half ago were very crude by today's standards, and what we didn't account for was the role of the ocean carbon cycle. The oceans are also pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So if we stop adding carbon pollution, then those levels of CO2 start to come down, and that's a cooling effect. And the two things cancel out, and the net result, it's almost like magic, but it really does work out this way. The warming stops almost immediately when we stop adding carbon pollution to the atmosphere. Surface temperatures stabilize very quickly. So this idea that we are still due for decades of warming no matter what we do isn't right. It does not reflect the current state of scientific understanding. There is a direct and immediate response to our efforts to decarbonize our world. And that's really important today. And I don't think that message has fully gotten out. Scientists have known that for more than a decade. A couple of years ago, I wrote an op-ed with some colleagues in the Washington Post, and I had some climate scientist colleagues saying, what's this? We all know that. It's like, yeah, you know that. The public doesn't know that. The journalists don't know that. The politicians don't know that. And so that still is something that hasn't fully been absorbed, to use that analogy here, in the public discourse.
It's one of the things I most appreciate about your work and the way you come into it. You talked about the doomism, the denial. We're in a media climate that, frankly, rewards being at one extreme or the other of these things, as opposed to saying, maybe it's more nuanced, maybe it's somewhere in the middle. Again, going back to that media portion.
I wish I had a solution to that problem.
Yeah, I was going to say, how do you go about navigating those kinds of discussions when everybody wants to hear either everything's going to be fine or it's all going the pot?
Yeah, we live in a clickbait, page view driven media world today. A lot of my best friends are journalists. It's literally true. Half of my home at Penn is the Annenberg School for Communication, and it's a real challenge because of sort of the profit model for media today. It is clickbait driven, and what lends itself to clicks are extreme claims and heated rhetoric, forgive the pun, and that does not lend itself to nuanced conversations or even sober conversations about what we need to do. It's either climate change isn't a problem or there's nothing we can do about it. Those are sort of the polar positions on the topic, and they get much more play than that sort of that mushier in-between, which is more difficult to navigate, and it doesn't give us the certainty that we often want. And I have to tell another story from the book that is about scientific uncertainty. It's the Ira Flato of Science Friday. I did a show last week. I've known him for some time now, and he's a wonderful guy, and he has these great stories. And there's this story that he recounts, and I retell it in the book. It was back in the days of supersonic transport, and they were worried that supersonic transport was harming the atmosphere, harming the environment. And there was a Senate hearing, I think chaired by Senator Muskie of, was he Ohio? Maine, thank you, Maine. And the scientist who's testifying comes with these two stacks of papers. And he says, on the one hand, there are these papers that say that, that this could create all sorts of environmental problems. But then there's this other stack of papers that says that, maybe it's not a problem at all. And Muskie famously said, can somebody just find me a one-handed scientist? And it really does speak to, unfortunately, you can't be a one-handed scientist because there is uncertainty. And here's the thing, uncertainty with this issue is not our friend. It's very important to reclaim the rightful role of uncertainty in this conversation, because in many respects, what we're seeing unfolding, now this isn't true, the warming is almost exactly what was predicted decades ago. In fact, as I talk about in my last book, the warming is almost exactly as was predicted by ExxonMobil's own scientists back in the early 1980s. In a secret report that ultimately got leaked to the public. Their own scientists in the early 1980s said that we were on a course that would lead, now this is not Al Gore's word, this is not the IPCC's word, this was ExxonMobil's own scientists, would lead to catastrophic consequences. But what did they do? They got rid of that research division, buried the report, and doubled down in a billions of dollar campaign to discredit independent science that was simply giving the same answer that their own scientists had come up with. So uncertainty is not our friend. The planet is warming up as we expect it to, as ExxonMobil expected it to. What's exceeding the predictions are some of the impacts of that warming. We're seeing earlier loss of a collapse of ice shelves and the potential destabilization of the ice sheets. We are seeing more extreme weather events, and some of my own research is involved in understanding the processes that are not well represented, even in state-of-the-art models, that are behind some of these very persistent summer weather extremes, the heat waves and wildfires and floods and superstorms that we've been seeing. So uncertainty in that regard is cutting against us. It's not cutting in our favor. It's not our friend. If anything, uncertainty is a reason for taking even more concerted action because of the very real possibility that the impacts will be worse than what we predicted.
So last question before...
Yeah, I should keep my answers a little shorter, so please.
You stop, and I'm so enraptured. I'm like, oh, I guess I have to ask another question now. The one last question I really want to ask is the other thing I very much appreciate your work is that your science and the work that you've done have brought you to this place of hope for the future. So, one, just what does make you hopeful there, and what are the things we need to be aware of pushing to make sure we meet that fragile moment, as you say in the book?
Yeah, thanks so much for that. I'll tell you, that's an easy one. It's the young folks. It's the way they're changing the conversation. It's the students that I teach at Penn who are so engaged. They're so informed. They're so articulate. We have this amazing next generation of leaders, but that's the problem. They're the next generation of leaders. We have to solve this problem now. And so to me, they are inspiring the youth climate movement. Sure, Greta Thunberg, but all of the other, it's a much more diverse movement than that. That has inspired me. It's changed the entire conversation. You hear stories of fossil fuel executives whose children come to them, Daddy, why are you destroying the planet? So it has changed the conversation in a fundamental way. It is essential that we not allow that to be in vain. They've sort of opened the door, but we have to walk through. We have to make the changes that they are not yet in a position to make themselves. We have to be inspired by them. We have to use our voice and our vote. And this next election is going to determine the path that we follow. It is a stark choice. It is a path of climate destruction or a path of embracing clean energy solutions and continuing to move in the direction that you helped move the state of Pennsylvania and in your capacity now at PennFuture are continuing to help move us in that direction. That's the choice that we face. And again, it's going to determine the planet that our children and grandchildren inherit. And we have to think about that going into this defining election.
Thank you so much. I want to open it up to the crowd. Alex has...
First, can we just give a round of applause for Michael?
Judging by your status in right-wing media, you are arguably the premier prophet of climate crisis. But what comes to my mind is, if I'm remembering my mythology correctly, Cassandra, the gift of prophecy, but she also had the problem of never being believed. Are you Cassandra? How do you deal with that all the time?
Well, thanks for that question. And it is about profit. It's about fossil fuel industry profits. But it's also about the prophetic, forecasts that were made again decades ago, not by these, ivory tower liberal professors and said, by ExxonMobil. ExxonMobil predicted, they were the Cassandra, if you like. Their own scientists were one of those Cassandras. It's a really interesting question because in today's world, there is no one audience, there is no one medium that reaches all audiences. We are such, as Patrick mentioned earlier, such a divided country today, politically and in every other way. We're divided in terms of our media diet. And so those, half of us watch television, news programs, and read newspapers and sort of feed upon a diet of sort of mainstream media that does present more or less an objective picture of what the science has to say. Sometimes it plays to these tendencies for overstatement, and that can be a problem as well. That can feed doomism, the overstatement of the problem. But by and large, we have this one media world in which people are exposed to, the laws of physics as they really are, the state of the atmosphere and our climate as it really is, and that's cause for concern. But then we have half of our population who are trapped in this bubble of misinformation. Misinformation is being kind. It's disinformation. It is misinformation that is intended to deceive. And of course, we've seen with Fox News having suffered lawsuits, having been found guilty of intentionally lying about things that might be politically expedient for them to lie about. Well, they've been doing that about climate for decades. And so we have those people. We all have, I'm going to go out on a limb and say we don't have a lot of those people in this audience today, probably. They don't come out in general to the events that I do. But we all have that uncle at Thanksgiving who we're going to see soon enough, who is fed that steady diet of misinformation and disinformation, and is very confident in their misinformed understanding of the way things are. As I alluded to before, I wish I had the solution to that problem, because I don't see how we solve a problem like the climate crisis without solving the more fundamental problem we face right now in the United States and writ large when it comes to democratic governance. There is an assault on democratic institutions. There's an assault on elites, on elite opinion, on informed opinion. There is this notion that, another great political sort of aphorism, the great New York senior senator Daniel P. Moynihan, who famously said, "You're entitled to your own opinions, but not your own facts," decades ago. Some of us in the audience will remember, there were the 3 network news programs, and every night Walter Cronkite would say, and that's the way it is on, September, whatever the date is today, I've forgotten, 26, it's the release date, I should know that one, 26, 2023, and we all accepted that that's the way it was, and we could agree to disagree about the political implications of those facts, but we had a common set of facts. We've lost that. And without that, and this is part of what we're doing at Annenberg, is trying to understand how to combat misinformation and disinformation. And one of my partners there is the great Kathleen Hall Jameson, who is a co-founder of factcheck.org, and she's the head of the Annenberg Center, the Annenberg Public Policy Center. And again, one of those luxuries that I have being at Penn, to be able to interact with people like Kathleen, who are really leading that effort to understand and combat disinformation, because it undermines our ability to solve any of these problems. Thank you. And I will keep my other answers shorter, because that was a really long answer.
Yeah, but I have 2 questions. One is, please talk about carbon capture. But before you do that, there's a Finland scientist that writes climate denial things periodically in the Wall Street Journal. Our Sunday paper published it this last Sunday, where he says, don't worry about the heat. There's more cold deaths each year than there are heat deaths.
Yeah.
Is that true or false?
It's like many things that Bjorn Lomborg, who's the name of the person.
I wrote a rebuttal one time in the Wall Street Journal. They didn't publish my rebuttal.
I'm sorry to hear that, because you're absolutely right, and you were smart to do that. I did the same thing this summer when Bjorn Lomborg published an op-ed in the climate-denying editorial pages of the Wall Street Journal, the Murdoch-owned Wall Street Journal, I'll just say that, because there's a global empire, the News Corp empire, that has sort of almost single-handedly promoted this sort of misinformation and disinformation around the world, including the United States. So they regularly publish disinformative pieces by people like Bjorn Lomborg. And this summer he wrote a piece saying, oh, well, you know, these wildfires have nothing to do with global warming. They did publish my letter to the editor. I even managed to sneak in the title of my book. Can't believe they let me get away with that. And I simply quoted, because you only get about 100 words. Bjorn gets, 700 words. If you're lucky if they give you 100 words. I simply quoted a piece that had appeared a week earlier on the news pages of the Wall Street Journal, because their news division is actually quite objective. It's straight up news reporting. And so I just quoted the title of an article that basically said, unprecedented warming leading to massive wildfires. And it contradicted the title of an article from a week ago in the Wall Street Journal, completely contradicted his entire thesis, the entire thesis of his op-ed. The same thing, there's often a grain of truth. For example, with wildfires, there are large grasslands now, the forests that have been deforested and replaced with grasslands, and these grasslands can burn very easily. And so there are large areas of grasslands that burn, and you can argue, oh, the area burned has gotten larger and larger. Yeah, the grasslands burn, but those aren't old growth forests with the biodiversity contained. So it's the forest burning that we're really and so he'll play with those sorts of tricks to sort of and the same thing here. The statistics that he's drawing upon are very misleading. It's not true, and the real point here is that heat deaths are likely to greatly outpace any deaths from cold as we continue to warm the planet. We will see far more mortality from extreme weather events as we warm the planet than we see today. And so what he's very good at is telling half the story and getting away with it in conservative outlets that are perfectly happy to let him tell half the story. I can tell you, if you try to publish an op-ed in the New York Times, they are fastidious about making sure that it is as objective as possible. I can't say the Wall Street Journal editorial pages have quite that same care. Oh, carbon capture. Deck chairs on the Titanic.
Yeah, question for you. Apart from misinformation or disinformation or lies or tricks, are there any credible analyses that go the other direction? And if so, what's the most persuasive? What would you counter with as to why we should not be persuaded by that argument?
I say the most persuasive argument of what?
The most persuasive or most credible analysis against your position, and why is it not correct?
Fair enough. We'll start with warming will be good for us. Okay, warming will be good for us, and this is one that I tackle because paleoclimate addresses that. Hey, 100 million years ago, CO2 levels were much higher than they are today, which is true. The planet was much warmer than it is today. There was no ice at either pole. The dinosaurs seemed perfectly happy, roaming the polar regions of the planet. So what's so bad about warmth? Well, okay, that was 100 million years ago, and what nature did, that carbon cycle that I was talking about, gradually buried that carbon beneath the surface of the Earth over 100 million years, okay? Over 100 million years, life can adjust to changing climate conditions. What are we doing? We're taking all of that carbon, and there's a reason that these periods are called the Pennsylvanian periods, for example, because all that coal, it was That was carbon that was in the atmosphere, and it got buried over time, over 100 million years. And now what are we doing? We're extracting it far more efficiently than nature ever could. We are taking all that carbon that got buried over 100 million years and releasing it back into the atmosphere over 100 years, 1,000,000 times faster. So it's the rate of the warming. It's the fact that we have more than 8 billion people who are dependent on the stability of the climate as it is today, and we are warming the climate, increasing the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and warming the planet at rates that have no precedent as far back as we go. And we look at those events in the book. That's the problem. So yeah, at the surface it sounds credible, but you dig, and that's what we do in paleoclimate. We dig beneath the surface. We look for fossils. We look for, you dig a little bit beneath the surface, and it falls apart.
I feel like I have to do the 30 seconds on. I once, in a hearing, was asked by one of our legislators, not even asked, it was proffered, the opinion was put forth that climate change was okay because he liked vegetables, and we would be growing more vegetables, which then meant I had to go and research that and find out that the nutritional value of vegetables actually drops in a warming climate. So you get more vegetables, but they're less valuable to you. I never got that question again, unfortunately, to actually put forth that answer.
We have a tough enough time getting our daughter to eat vegetables in the first place, and now you make them less nutritious. It's just a disaster.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Mann, for everything that you have done, scientifically, hockey stick and all. And I'm very sorry that you left Penn State. I'm a professor of public policy at Penn State, Harrisburg. But I'm happy for you that you're at UPenn. And I'm happy to hear that you are working in that kind of environment, in that center, because, and that brings me to my next point, and maybe a subtle challenge for you. That is this. You said that dinosaurs did not have agency, but we do, which may be true, but human agency is not a singular word. It is plural. And you mentioned all these issues with disinformation and Fox News and all the rest and so forth. If you think about this issue of global warming or climate crisis, it is a universal thing for whole humanity. And whole humanity is composed of more than 7 billion people and multiple agencies. And that is a huge challenge, even if we ignore or somehow solve the problem of disinformation. Just take one example, a concrete example. That is the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a wonderful act. Of course, it is groundbreaking, and it's very, very important. But look what it does. It creates incentives for those multiple agencies to take action. That is, these individual human beings, like myself and my wife, we are talking about these conversions to solar panels and all the rest, as well as some producers of solar panels, as well as the contractors, as well as state governments and local governments and so forth. So we are talking about these multitude of entities and agencies, which creates an actually extremely complex environment. And if you can, and this is a social system which is extremely complex, even more complex than physical systems, chemical systems, I must add, infinitely more complex. So if you can make a contribution in that center to help that social environment, social systems, not necessarily create a singular human agency, but at least informed and maybe some cohesive agency, that would be extremely helpful. With that, I appreciate that you have doing.
Thanks very much for the kind words and for the commentary. And I agree with that. I would say that that's sort of what I hope that we're doing with our center. Ultimately, just as you say, the solutions to the climate crisis, we should all do everything we can as individuals, of course, decrease our carbon footprint. But an industry the fossil fuel industry would happily, and that's what my last book was about, make it all on us, all on us as individuals to deflect attention from the need for systemic change, because there's no way we're going to achieve the reductions in carbon emissions that are necessary without changes in incentives for individuals, policies that create incentives for people to make the right choices. And you can do that carbon pricing or emissions trading. There are lots of the original version of the clean energy standard. So the IRA originally was envisioned as having a clean energy standard that was an alternative, for example, to carbon pricing, but there was both carrot and stick. There was incentives, subsidies for renewable energy, but there was also disincentives for polluters, for carbon polluters. Well, that passed a Senate, 50-50 Senate, with a tie-breaking vote by a Democratic vice president, and the only way it could get passed by Congress, passed into law, signed by Joe Biden, was to get the vote of a coal state Democrat who was dead set against the stick side of the equation. And so we got a much weaker Inflation Reduction Act, a much weaker set of climate provisions than we would have had that individual, Joe Manchin, not been the sort of deciding vote. And so to me, the funny thing is then it does come back to individuals, right? Because we get the politicians we vote for. It comes back to, it's collective action, but it's all of us participating in the political process and doing what we can to vote out the rubber stamps for polluters and to vote in climate advocates. And so it does come down to us in the end, but you're absolutely right. We can't solve it as individuals. We need systemic change. And that's just the United States. This has to be solved, addressed in a multilateral way. But if the United States isn't doing our part, and we've seen this time and again, we can't expect the Indias and the Chinas of the world to come to the table. And so it does require American leadership. American leadership is going to require us electing the right leaders.
We've got to wrap up soon, but I have 3 more questions I want to get through.
Thank you, Dr. Mann. I'm heading to a conference with my conservation group, 15,000 members out in Spokane, and one of my things coming tonight was to take a couple of your books along to spread the word. But that's our goal, is to educate about the climate change. It's Trout Unlimited. You may be familiar with that organization, but second part of that.
It's always sounded very tasty to me, actually.
Yeah, well, my daughter-in-law says this is where you can go and get all the trout you can eat. But I caught an interview with John Kerry yesterday, and he was rather enthusiastic about all of the things that are happening in his role. And I'm curious, is it justified?
It's funny. Thanks for the question. Yeah, Trout Unlimited does wonderful work. I'm often accused by some of my detractors as being Pollyannish, as being a sunny optimist. But I ain't got nothing on John Kerry, because when you listen to him, it just sounds. So I think to some extent he overplays. I think he's done a great job. He was a secretary, as the former secretary under Joe Biden, and as in the role that he's played in under Barack Obama, and the role that he's played as a climate emissary in the Biden administration. He's done really important diplomatic work and helped sort of repair some of those, the frayed relations with other countries from the previous administration, and repairing that damage has been critical. Reestablishing credibility, American credibility on the world stage when it comes to these negotiations has been really important. So he's done really important work. But I have seen him time and again oversell, somebody asked about carbon capture earlier, oversell this idea that technology is going to, techno-fixes are going to get us out of this problem. The sort of technology that we're talking about even in the best case scenario, it'll only play out meaningfully decades from now. And we've got to reduce carbon emissions 50% this decade and down to zero by the middle of the century. We're not going to do that with, new technology. We're going to do that with existing technology. We've got the technology. We've got wind, solar, geothermal, smart grid, efficiency and conservation measures. We've got everything that we need to solve this problem. We don't need to appeal to, as yet, theoretical technology, but it's very convenient for polluters to hold that out there. It's like, oh yeah, we can fix this problem. We'll invest in, in geoengineering and carbon capture and sequestration. It's largely, in my view, served the role of greenwash. It's allowed polluters to talk a good game while they're really just paying lip service and not doing anything meaningful in terms of reducing carbon emissions. So John Kerry, so I think he buys a little bit too much into that, but that's a minor deduction. I give him a B+.
Thank you for coming to Harrisburg. Thank you for all of your important and great work. Suppose someone suggested that while it's crucially important to vote politicians into office, voting politicians into office won't change Wall Street. It won't change the finance system. It won't change corporate capital. It won't change the irrational quest to constantly accumulate more and more capital by destroying ecosystems, by endlessly producing more fossil fuel, et cetera. So what about the economic system outside the political system? What about changes there?
Yeah, fair enough. Good question, good point. The climate crisis has a short fuse. So my view is that we've got to solve that problem now within the framework of the system that exists, whether we like it or not. But that does not absolve us of the responsibility to, at the same time, try to change that system for the better. And you can argue, I think quite compellingly, that we cannot continue on this course of an ever-growing, resource-driven global economy that's fundamentally incompatible with the finite resources of a finite planet. Ultimately, we need a system that does not rely on continued extraction of resources and economic growth. And there's talk about circular economy. There are ideas about what sort of system we could move towards, which is more sustainable. And I think we have to be having those conversations at the same time. So, we sort of have to walk and chew gum at the same time there, I suppose is my answer.
The only thing I would add is I think that's also something that can get leveraged in a positive direction, right? It really is a policy issue at a certain level right now. Solar right now is the cheapest thing to put on the grid in our grid. It just is. And when I was at DEP, and we were trying to do clean power plan and those kind of things, some of the people I was meeting with from some of these companies, it wasn't the environmental person, it was the accountant, because they had bonds out there, and they would have to bond the next thing. You're talking about companies that if they do the next thing, they're looking for 10, 20-year money to do it. And that's not a safe bet anymore for a lot of these companies. So there is an economic element that actually pushes positively and that can get leveraged positively if we're thinking about it in those terms.
Thank you, Dr. Mann. Now I realize I do have to buy your book, and I look forward to doing that tonight. But I'm reminded, as you're talking about the youth, and thank goodness for them, I'm also reminded of Bill McKibben, who reminds those of us with gray hair that we have the freedom, many of us, to be talking to our legislators, to making a difference. So I'd like to put in a plug for those of us with gray hair, getting out and doing more. And I want
Those of us with no hair, too, I think qualify in that regard.
I also want to say that there are a group of us here from Market Square Presbyterian Church who take this all very seriously. And we have used PennFuture with gratitude for what the roles that you play, because we just had Michael 2 weeks ago with us at Market Square. He was excellent. We need that kind of help to be effective in talking with our legislatures. So thank you so much for the wide range of what you're doing.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that. Really appreciate it.
I wanted to follow up on a little bit on the extraction and the ethics behind that, because extraction leads to a lot of harm around the world. I drive an electric car, and I wanted to know your thoughts about the ethics of that extraction and about the importance of the recent find of lithium in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, so there, and that gets at this, in a way it dovetails with this previous question. You know, the argument is we can go to wind turbines and solar panels, and yeah, but that requires resources. It requires, you know, rare metals, and that requires continued extraction. And with extraction, you get pollution, you get the disturbance of ecosystems, and so that cannot be the solution in the end to all that threatens us. That cannot be a sustainable solution. We do have to get away from extraction writ large, ultimately. That having been said, there are some misleading arguments that one sees out there. I don't know how many of you saw Planet of the Humans. This was Michael Moore's latest film. It was celebrated by Fox News and the right-wing media. That sort of tells you a lot about it, because it was really a, you know, it was a full-on sort of assault on sort of the clean energy revolution. It was arguing that, you know, that the alternatives are even worse in terms of their environmental footprint. And that's not true. It's just not true. I mean, it's yes, there are still environmental externalities associated with extraction of those materials, but it's not anywhere near the sort of, even if you get away from the sort of the climate impacts, which is what ultimately we're talking about here, just, you know, what happens when, you know, these sort of, you know, fracking and, you know, hydraulic fracturing to get at natural gas, blowing up the tops of mountains to get at the coal beneath. I mean, the disturbance to ecosystems, to water and air quality, you know, the threat, the mortality threat from air quality and water quality, consequences of drilling for natural gas and oil and coal, it's an order of magnitude worse. So that doesn't mean that the alternative is great for the environment. It's not. And so, I mean, I don't contest the basic thesis of your question. Yeah, we can't continue to extract materials. There's the damage that that extraction does to the environment. There are the economic repercussions. Extraction-based countries tend to have much greater levels of social and economic inequality. We know that as well. And there are finite resources. So, you know, that can't be the ultimate solution to all that plagues us. But clean energy is a heck of a lot better than our continued reliance on fossil fuel energy.
We are running out of time, so this will be our last question.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure to learn from you this evening. At the beginning of your talk, you were speaking about the interdisciplinary aspects of climate change. It's potentially the most interdisciplinary problem we've ever encountered. Can you speak to some of the most interesting or consequential collaborations that you've had with social scientists or people in the humanities?
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question. You know, there's so many, I mean, there are lots of different directions I could try to tell. I have some of my colleagues in the German literature department are at Penn, Simon Richter, for example, are some of the strongest climate advocates and have been very involved in climate efforts at Penn. And it's sort of interesting to me that they come out of Germanic literature, but there's something there that, and I think it has to do with sort of the environmental ethos in Germany in the 1970s, 1980s. There was a very strong environmental movement, and it impacted literature. It's very pervasive. And so they bring something very interesting to the table. And my colleague Bethany Wiggin, who's the other German literature professor, she heads up a project. And we had a PBS event where we sort of got into this a bit. It's called My Climate Story. And she interviews young folks and sort of helps them extract their story, helps them tell their story about how climate change is impacting them in a very direct way. And it's very moving when you hear these stories because they're very real. They're coming from children. They have the sort of moral purity and authority of coming from our children. That's what won the court case in Montana, the Held case. It was the stories told by children in Montana that led the very conservative courts of the Supreme Court of Montana to decide in favor of the children and against the fossil fuel industry, and that they have to now consider the impacts of climate change in any additional fossil fuel infrastructure outlays. So there's an example of humanity's storytelling narrative and how direct an impact it's actually having on the ground in terms of very real climate policy developments. And so I'm tapped in to those efforts. Our center has participated in a number of events with Bethany and others where we sort of explore that side of things. And then I would say on the social science side, just sort of there's the science of climate, but what I've come to appreciate from Kathleen and others is there's the science of science communication, and it is a science, and you have to really be steeped in the literature and understand it. And so, yeah, and I could go on, but those are a couple examples.
We do have to wrap up, but can we give one more round of applause for Patrick and Mike? Michael, congratulations on your new book. Thanks for coming to Harrisburg. We have books available for purchase up at the cafe. Just one more reminder that 10% of your purchase goes directly towards PennFuture. Thank you again to Patrick for coming out and moderating, and thanks everyone for coming out. Have a good night.
And thank you, Midtown Book Scholar.
Yes. Absolutely. Thanks so much.
This is the signing table here.